The day my parents left me out of there, well, wasn't the day my heart broke. It was the day I realized it had been breaking for years. I was sitting in my father's study in Charleston, South Carolina, staring at shelves lined with family photos and awards that told the story of a perfect family. At least that's what everyone believed. The Hayes family, respected, successful, admired. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. Inside those walls, however, there was a truth nobody saw, a truth I had spent most of my life pretending didn't hurt. My name is Charlotte Hayes. I'm 35 years old. And for as long as I can remember, I have lived in the shadow of my older brother, Mason, the golden child, the favorite, the son who could do no wrong, and me. I was simply the daughter who was expected to understand, expected to sacrifice, expected to survive on her own. What I didn't know that afternoon was that a single decision my parents made would uncover a secret buried for years. A secret so devastating that it would destroy everything they believed about their precious son. But before I tell you how everything fell apart, you need to understand how it all began. Because family betrayals don't happen overnight. They happen one small wound at a time, one disappointment at a time, one ignored child at a time, and mine started when I was 8 years old. The first time I realized my parents treated Mason differently was during a school awards ceremony. I remember standing backstage in a blue dress, nervously holding a certificate. I had won first place in a statewide writing competition. My teacher had told me it was a huge accomplishment. I couldn't wait to see my parents. I kept looking toward the auditorium doors, waiting. Watching, hoping, the ceremony started. Then it ended. The seats where my parents were supposed to be remained empty. I told myself there must be a reason. There always was. When I got home that evening, I found them in the kitchen. My mother looked guilty. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. Mason had baseball practice, Mom explained. As if that explained everything. I was 8 years old. Even then, I understood what she wasn't saying. Mason mattered more. A few months later, my brother struck out during an important game. My parents took him out for dinner, bought him gifts, spent the entire weekend cheering him up. When I asked why they missed my award ceremony, my father simply smiled. "You're strong, Charlotte." At the time, it sounded like a compliment. Years later, I realized it was an excuse. People often reward the child who struggles loudly. They forget about the child who suffers quietly. And that child was me. As we grew older, the pattern never changed. Mason was charismatic, confident, funny. The kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. People loved him, especially my parents. He had a gift for making everyone believe he was trying his best, even when he wasn't. I was different. I preferred books to parties, planning to improvising, working hard instead of talking big. While Mason dreamed about becoming rich overnight, I spent years building real goals. I studied constantly, earned scholarships, graduated near the top of my class. By the time I finished college, I had secured a position at a respected financial consulting firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and I was proud of it. The problem was, my parents weren't. Not really. Whenever family friends visited, they always asked about Mason first, and my parents happily answered. Mason is working on a new business opportunity. Mason has incredible potential. Mason is going to do something big one day. I would sit quietly at the dinner table wondering if anyone remembered. I existed. Even when I earned promotions, even when I bought my first home, even when I accomplished things Mason never had, the conversation somehow always returned to him. Always. By my early 30s, I had accepted a painful truth. I would never be my parents' favorite child. No matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I loved them. I told myself I could live with that, and for a while I did. I built a peaceful life in Charleston. I bought a beautiful house near the water. I surrounded myself with good friends. I focused on my career. Eventually, I became a senior financial advisor. The position required long hours and discipline, but I loved the work. unlike Mason. By then, he had bounced through countless business ventures: restaurants, real estate, cryptocurrency, online marketing. Every year brought a new dream. Every year ended the same way: failure. And every time he failed, my parents rescued him. At first, it was small amounts of money, then larger amounts, then even larger. Whenever I questioned it, my mother became defensive. "He's trying, Charlotte," my father would nod. "Success takes time." Maybe, but responsibility shouldn't. And that was Mason's real problem: he never faced consequences. Someone always caught him before he hit the ground. Usually my parents. One Sunday afternoon, I visited my parents for lunch. Their waterfront estate looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Perfect landscaping, perfect gardens, perfect image. Inside, however, tension lingered beneath the surface. Mason arrived nearly an hour late. As usual, nobody said a word, not even my father. Instead, my mother hugged him. "I'm so glad you're here." I couldn't help noticing the contrast. If I had arrived late, there would have been questions, explanations, disappointment. Mason simply smiled and sat down. The meal continued. Then the conversation shifted. My father asked Mason about his newest venture. For 30 minutes, everyone listened while he described another ambitious business plan. I watched silently. The numbers didn't make sense. The projections were unrealistic. The risks were enormous. But nobody challenged him, not even once. When I carefully pointed out a few concerns, Mason laughed. "Not everything can be measured on a spreadsheet, Charlotte." My parents chuckled. I forced a smile, but inside I felt something familiar. That same childhood ache, that same feeling of being invisible. A week later, I received a call from my mother. "Your father wants the family together next month." "Why?" There was a brief pause. "Some legal matters." I didn't think much of it. My parents were getting older. Estate planning seemed normal. At 35, I understood these conversations eventually happen in every family. Still, something about her tone felt strange, almost nervous. When I hung up, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't ignore it either. The following month arrived faster than expected. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. I left work early and drove to my parents' estate. Dark clouds covered the Charleston sky. The air felt heavy, like a storm was waiting. When I entered the house, everyone was already there. My father, my mother, Mason, and a woman I recognized immediately, Victoria Grant, the family attorney. The moment I saw her, my stomach tightened. This wasn't a casual conversation. Something serious was about to happen. Victoria greeted me politely. My father remained unusually quiet. Mason looked relaxed, almost pleased, as if he already knew something I didn't, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely nervous. The meeting began. Victoria opened a folder. My father folded his hands together. My mother stared at the floor. Then Victoria spoke. "Richard and Catherine have finalized their estate plan." The room suddenly felt smaller. I listened carefully as she explained properties, investments, trust accounts, family assets, millions of dollars accumulated over decades. Then she reached the section that changed everything. The section that would expose a truth none of us were prepared for. A truth that would eventually tear our family apart. And as Victoria looked down at the document in front of her, I had no idea that my entire world was about to change. The blood slowly drained from my face. At first, I thought I had misunderstood what Victoria Grant was reading. Maybe I had missed a detail. Maybe there was another page. Maybe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense. But there wasn't. The family home overlooking Charleston Harbor would go to Mason. The beach property on Kiowa Island would go to Mason. The investment accounts would go to Mason. The family trust would go to Mason. One asset after another. One sentence after another. One blow after another. And then Victoria reached the end. The room fell silent. I waited. Surely there had to be more. Surely my name would appear somewhere. A trust. A percentage. A keepsake. Anything. Instead, Victoria slowly closed the folder. And that was when I realized the truth. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I had just been erased from my own family's future. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt unbearable. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I looked at my father first. Richard Hayes sat stiffly in his chair. His expression was unreadable. Then I looked at my mother. Catherine couldn't even meet my eyes. That hurt more than anything, because guilt only appears when someone knows they've done something wrong. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "Is that everything?" Victoria glanced toward my parents before answering. "Yes." The word landed like a hammer. I swallowed hard. "There's nothing for me." Again, silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything before anyone says a word. Then my father cleared his throat. "We discussed this carefully." I stared at him. My entire childhood flashed through my mind. Every sacrifice, every achievement, every moment I convinced myself things would eventually change. And suddenly I realized they never had. Not really. My father folded his hands. "You've always been independent, Charlotte." There it was, the same explanation I'd heard my entire life, the same excuse, the same justification. As if being responsible somehow made me less deserving of love, less deserving of support, less deserving of family. My mother finally spoke. "Sweetheart, please don't take this personally." I almost laughed. Don't take it personally. How exactly was I supposed to take it? Professionally, like a business transaction. I had just watched my parents hand their entire legacy to my brother while pretending it wasn't about favoritism. Across the room, Mason remained unusually quiet, but I noticed something. The corner of his mouth twitched, a tiny smile, barely visible yet impossible to miss, and in that moment something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Like glass finally giving up after years of pressure. I don't remember much about leaving that afternoon. Only fragments, the sound of rain hitting my windshield, the blur of traffic lights. The tightness in my chest. I drove home on autopilot. When I finally walked through my front door, the silence felt overwhelming. For the first time in years, I cried, not because of the money. People always assume inheritance stories are about greed. This wasn't. It was about what the money represented. Validation, recognition, proof that I mattered, and according to my parents, I didn't. At least not enough. The following weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I stopped visiting my parents. I ignored phone calls. I avoided family gatherings. Friends noticed something was wrong. I kept telling everyone I was fine. I wasn't. At night, I replayed the meeting over and over, searching for some explanation, some hidden reason, something I had missed. But every road led back to the same conclusion. My parents had chosen Mason. Again, just like they always had. One evening, my best friend, Lauren, invited me to dinner. We had known each other for nearly 15 years. If anyone could read me, it was Lauren. Halfway through the meal, she put down her fork. "Okay," I sighed. "Okay, what? Stop pretending." I looked away. She leaned forward. "You look exhausted." I laughed bitterly. "That's because I am." She waited, patiently. Eventually, the whole story spilled out. The will, the meeting, the humiliation, everything. When I finished, Lauren looked horrified. "They left you nothing?" I nodded. "Nothing." Her jaw tightened. "Charlotte, that's insane." I shrugged. "It shouldn't surprise me." "Why?" "Because it's always been this way." Lauren stared at me for several seconds. Then she said something that stuck with me. "Just because you've gotten used to something doesn't mean it's normal." I didn't answer, because deep down I knew she was right. A few days later, something strange happened. I received an email from an unknown sender. There was no message, just an attachment. At first, I assumed it was spam, but something made me pause. The subject line simply read, "You deserve to know." A chill ran down my spine. I opened the attachment. Inside was a scanned financial statement. The document appeared old. Maybe 6 or 7 years old. Across the top was the name of one of my father's investment companies. I frowned. Why would someone send me this? Then I noticed several highlighted transactions. Large withdrawals, very large withdrawals, hundreds of thousands of dollars. My heart began beating faster. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Only 6 words. 6 words that changed everything. Look at who approved them. I immediately searched the document, near the signatures section, near the authorization records, and then I saw a familiar name. Mason Hayes. I stared at the screen, confused. My brother had never worked for my father's company. He shouldn't have been authorizing anything. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was another explanation, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the document. I called the sender's email address. No response, I replied. Nothing. Whoever had sent it clearly didn't want to be identified, which only made me more suspicious. That evening, I printed the statement and studied it again. The numbers were enormous. Far larger than anything my father would casually overlook. Yet somehow nobody had ever mentioned these transactions. At least not around me. I found myself asking questions I never expected. What exactly had Mason been doing all these years? How much financial help had he actually received? And why would someone anonymously send me proof connected to him? The more I thought about it, the less comfortable I became. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. This time it was a phone call. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years, James Walker. My father's longtime business partner. I answered immediately. James, his voice sounded tense. Charlotte, we need to talk. My stomach tightened. About what? A long pause followed. The kind of pause people make when they're deciding how much truth to reveal. Finally, he spoke. There's something your father doesn't know. I sat up straight. What are you talking about? Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that would eventually destroy my parents' image of their perfect son. Years ago, James said quietly, a huge amount of money disappeared from one of your father's investment accounts. I froze. What? We believed it was a failed investment. My pulse quickened. And now, James exhaled slowly, now we're not so sure. The room suddenly felt colder. What does that have to do with Mason? Silence. Then, more than you can imagine. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. My mind raced. The anonymous document, the highlighted transactions, the signatures, the strange timing. None of it felt random anymore. James lowered his voice. Charlotte, I think someone has been lying to your family for years. A chill crawled down my spine. What are you saying? His answer came slowly, carefully, as though even he couldn't fully believe it. I'm saying that if these records are accurate, he paused, then finished the sentence. Your brother may have stolen from your parents. My breath caught. The words felt impossible, unthinkable, yet suddenly, everything started making sense. And for the first time since the will reading, I wasn't thinking about what my parents had taken from me. I was thinking about what someone else might have taken from them. I barely slept that night. The folder James Walker had sent me sat open on my laptop like a ticking time bomb. Every time I tried to close it and walk away, my eyes drifted back to the screen. Back to the numbers, back to the signatures, back to my brother's name. Mason Hayes, again, and again, and again. By 2 a.m, my dining room table was covered with printed documents. Bank statements, investment reports, transfer records, corporate filings. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. At first, I kept searching for an innocent explanation, a misunderstanding, a clerical error, anything, because no matter how difficult my relationship with Mason had been, he was still my brother, the boy I grew up with. The boy who used to build blanket forts in our living room. The boy who once promised he'd always protect me. But memories have a way of losing their power when facts start speaking. And the facts were becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning, I called James. The moment he answered, I asked the question that had been haunting me all night. How long have you known about this? He sighed heavily. Not long. Then how did you find it? There was a pause. When your father asked me to review some old investment records, I frowned. Why? Because something wasn't adding up. I leaned back in my chair. Outside my kitchen window, rain drizzled across Charleston. The gray sky matched my mood perfectly. James continued. For years, Richard believed a failed development project caused the losses. I remembered hearing about that project. Everyone in the family did. It had become one of those stories people repeated at holiday dinners. A bad investment, bad timing, bad luck. End of story, except now it wasn't. Because according to these records, the money never disappeared. It moved, very deliberately, very quietly, and somehow nobody noticed, or maybe nobody wanted to. That afternoon, I drove to James's office. His building overlooked Charleston Harbor, the same harbor my father loved, the same harbor where he'd spent decades building his business empire. Walking into the office felt strange. I had known James almost my entire life. He'd attended family holidays, birthday parties, graduations. He wasn't just a business partner. He was practically family, which made his expression even more unsettling. James looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. Stacks of documents covered his desk. The moment I sat down, he handed me another folder. Thicker than the first, much thicker, my stomach tightened. "What's in here?" His answer chilled me. "Everything we've found so far." For the next 3 hours, we reviewed records together. By the end, my head was spinning. The pattern was becoming clear. Years earlier, shortly after Mason's first business failure, money had begun leaving several family-controlled accounts. Never enough to attract immediate attention. Never enough to trigger alarms. But over time, the amounts became enormous. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, then millions. The withdrawals were spread across years, carefully disguised, broken into smaller transactions. Hidden inside complicated financial structures. Whoever designed the scheme understood exactly how to avoid suspicion. And that realization terrified me, because Mason wasn't a financial expert. Not even close. He barely balanced his own checkbook, which meant someone had helped him. "Do you think he acted alone?" I finally asked. James looked uncomfortable. "Honestly," I nodded. "No." The room fell silent. A cold feeling settled into my chest. If Mason hadn't acted alone, then who? Another employee, a financial advisor, someone inside the company. The possibilities seemed endless, yet one thing remained certain. The story was much bigger than I originally believed. Much bigger. As evening approached, James opened one final file. "This is what concerns me most." I leaned forward. The document showed a series of transfers connected to a private account. Nothing unusual at first glance, until I saw the account holder. My breath caught instantly. Mason Hayes. I stared at the page, then looked up, then back down. Surely I was misunderstanding something, but the name remained, clear, undeniable, Mason Hayes. The transfers stretched across several years, and the total amount nearly made me fall out of my chair. Over $3 million. $3 million. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. Couldn't process what I was seeing. All those years, all those financial rescues, all those stories about bad luck and failed businesses, and somehow Mason had access to millions. Money that clearly hadn't come from his companies, because his companies never made money. Suddenly, memories started resurfacing. Moments I had dismissed years earlier. Moments that now looked completely different. I remembered Mason buying a luxury boat despite claiming he was struggling financially. I remembered his expensive vacations, the sports cars, the designer watches, the extravagant lifestyle. At the time, I assumed my parents were secretly helping him. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe he wasn't receiving money. Maybe he was taking it. And nobody knew. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely afraid. Not for myself, for my parents, because they had built everything from scratch. Richard Hayes wasn't born wealthy. Neither was Catherine. They spent decades creating their business, sacrificing weekends, missing vacations, working late nights. Everything they owned represented years of effort, years of sacrifice, years of dreams. And according to these documents, their favorite son may have been quietly draining it all away. That evening, I drove home in complete silence. The city lights reflected across wet pavement. Traffic moved around me, but my mind remained somewhere else. Back in James's office, back with those numbers, back with those signatures. Back with the terrifying possibility that my brother had spent years betraying the people who trusted him most. The people who had given him everything. The people who had chosen him over me. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Mom, Catherine Hayes. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Hello, her voice sounded hesitant. Charlotte. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she broke the silence. We miss you. I closed my eyes. Months ago, those words would have meant everything. Now they felt different. Complicated, painful. I've been busy. It wasn't entirely a lie, just not the whole truth, she sighed softly. Your father has been worried. The irony nearly made me laugh, worried. After cutting me out of the will, after spending decades choosing Mason, now he was worried. I swallowed the bitterness. What do you need, Mom? Another pause. Then she said something unexpected. Mason has been having a difficult time lately. Of course, even now, even after everything, the conversation somehow returned to Mason, always Mason. I looked at the stack of financial records sitting on my kitchen counter. The evidence, the transfers, the lies, and suddenly I felt an overwhelming urge to tell her everything. Right then. Right there, expose it all. But I didn't, not yet, because accusations without proof destroy families. Facts reveal truth, and I needed more facts. The next morning brought another surprise. Victoria Grant called me, the family attorney, the same attorney who had read the will. Her voice sounded serious. Charlotte, I'd like to meet. My pulse quickened. Why? Because there are things happening behind the scenes that concern me. I sat upright. What kind of things? Silence. Then, the kind that could affect your entire family. A chill ran down my spine. Victoria wasn't someone who exaggerated. If she sounded worried, there was a reason. A serious reason. We agreed to meet the following day. After hanging up, I stared at my phone. The pieces were moving now. Fast, too fast. James was uncovering financial discrepancies. Victoria was suddenly concerned. Anonymous documents had appeared out of nowhere, and somewhere in the middle of all of it stood Mason. Smiling, confident, completely unaware that the walls were beginning to close in around him. That night, I opened the folder one more time. One final review before bed. I wasn't expecting to find anything new. Then I noticed something. A transfer record I'd somehow overlooked. A large transfer, nearly $500,000. The date caught my attention immediately, because it happened only 3 weeks before my parents finalized their will. 3 weeks. I leaned closer. Reading every detail carefully, and then I saw it. The destination account. The account receiving the money. My heart nearly stopped, because for the first time, the transfer wasn't hidden. It wasn't indirect. It wasn't complicated. It led straight to Mason, directly, clearly, undeniably, and attached to the transfer was a note, just 5 words. 5 words that changed everything. Final distribution before transfer. I stared at the screen, confused, terrified, trying to understand what it meant. Then the realization hit me, hard, like a punch to the chest. What if Mason hadn't merely stolen money? What if he was preparing for something bigger? Something far more dangerous? Something involving my parents' entire estate? I barely made it through the drive to Victoria Grant's office. The entire morning, my mind kept returning to the same question. How much worse could this possibly get? For weeks, I'd been uncovering pieces of a nightmare. The missing money, the secret transfers, the hidden accounts. The lies, surely that was enough. Surely there couldn't be anything more devastating than discovering your brother had secretly taken millions from the parents who worshipped him. I was wrong. Very wrong. Because when Victoria slid that confidential file across her desk, I discovered the betrayal ran far deeper than money. Victoria's office overlooked Charleston Harbor. Normally, the view was calming. Today, I barely noticed it. My eyes remained fixed on the folder in front of me. Before you open it, Victoria said quietly, you need to understand something. I looked up. Her expression was unusually serious. This information has not been shown to your parents yet. A chill ran through me. What is it? She took a slow breath. The reason I started reviewing the estate records. My stomach tightened. Slowly, I opened the folder. The first few pages looked ordinary, trust documents, asset summaries, property schedules. Then I reached a series of amendments, and everything changed. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The legal language was dense, complicated, page after page of revisions. But one detail immediately stood out. Mason's name, again and again and again. The further I read, the more disturbed I became. Over the past 3 years, my parents' estate plan had been modified repeatedly. Each change increased Mason's control. Each change reduced oversight. Each change made it easier for him to access family assets. By the final amendment, he would effectively control nearly everything. Even before my parents passed away, I looked up, confused. Why would they do this? Victoria's answer was immediate. Because they trusted him. The words hit harder than I expected. Trust, that was always the answer. Trust was the reason Mason never faced consequences. Trust was the reason my parents ignored warning signs. Trust was the reason they left me out of the will. And now trust was threatening to destroy everything they'd spent decades building. I continued reading. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A power of attorney authorization. One that would have allowed Mason extraordinary authority over family finances if either parent became incapacitated. The document wasn't illegal, but it was dangerous. Especially considering everything we'd already discovered. I stared at the page, trying to imagine what could happen if Mason gained unrestricted access to millions of dollars. The answer terrified me because based on his history there might not be anything left. Victoria folded her hands. There's more. My heart sank. Of course there was, there always was. She handed me another document. This one wasn't from the estate files. It was from a private investigator. I blinked. A private investigator? Victoria nodded. After certain transactions began raising concerns, James and I hired someone to conduct a discreet review. I felt my pulse quicken. What did they find? For a moment, she hesitated. Then she answered, They found debt. I frowned. How much debt? Victoria looked directly at me. More than $8 million. The room seemed to tilt. $8 million. I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Mason owes $8 million. At minimum. I stared at her in disbelief. My brother had spent years pretending to be successful. Years pretending every failed venture was just a temporary setback. Meanwhile, he was buried beneath a mountain of debt. A mountain large enough to destroy lives. Suddenly, everything made sense. The missing money, the secret transfers, the desperation, the increasing access to family assets. It wasn't greed alone, it was survival. Mason wasn't stealing because he wanted luxury. He was stealing because he was drowning. And if the truth emerged, everything would collapse. His reputation, his businesses, his image, everything. The investigators' report revealed even more. Several creditors had been aggressively pursuing repayment. Private lenders, investment groups, former business partners, people who wanted their money back, and they were running out of patience. I closed the report slowly. For the first time, I understood the full picture. Mason wasn't simply protecting a secret. He was protecting an entire illusion, an illusion built on lies. And sooner or later, illusions always break. As I left Victoria's office, one thing became painfully clear. The truth could no longer remain hidden, not because I wanted revenge. Because my parents were in danger. Real danger, financially, legally, emotionally. The longer this continued, the worse the damage would become. But exposing Mason wouldn't be simple. Because people rarely abandon lifelong beliefs overnight, especially parents. Especially parents who have spent decades believing their son could do no wrong. That evening, I met James Walker again. This time, the mood felt different, more urgent, more serious. The evidence had grown overwhelming. The question was no longer whether Mason had betrayed my parents. The question was how to prove it in a way they couldn't ignore. James spread dozens of documents across a conference table. Bank records, corporate filings, debt disclosures, property transfers. Years of deception condensed into paper. Looking at it all together felt surreal, like staring at the blueprint of a disaster. We need to be careful, James said. I nodded. He was right. One mistake could allow Mason to explain everything away. One emotional accusation could turn my parents against us. We needed facts, clear, undeniable facts, the kind that survive denial, the kind that survive excuses, the kind that survive love. For the next several weeks, we worked quietly, methodically. Every transaction was verified, every signature authenticated, every transfer traced. Victoria coordinated with forensic accountants. James reviewed historical records, and I helped connect timelines, dates, events, patterns. The deeper we dug, the stronger the case became. What began as suspicion transformed into certainty. There was no innocent explanation, no misunderstanding, no accounting error. The evidence pointed in one direction, toward Mason, every single time. Meanwhile, my parents remained completely unaware. They continued hosting charity events, attending social gatherings, planning family holidays, living inside the version of reality they believed was true, a reality where Mason was successful, responsible, trustworthy. Watching it unfold became increasingly painful. Because I knew what was coming, and once the truth surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. Then came the final breakthrough, the piece that changed everything. The piece that eliminated every possible excuse. It arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, an original signed agreement, hidden inside archived business records. The document directly connected Mason to a series of unauthorized asset transfers. Not indirectly, not circumstantially, directly. His signature appeared clearly, repeatedly, legally verified. Impossible to dispute. When James called me, his voice shook. "We got him." I closed my eyes, not from happiness, not from satisfaction, from sadness. Because despite everything, this was still my brother. And the moment that document surfaced, I knew there was no going back. 3 days later, Victoria scheduled a family meeting. The same dining room, the same house, the same table where I'd been excluded from the will. Only this time the purpose was different. This time we weren't discussing inheritance. We were discussing truth. My parents agreed to attend. Mason agreed too, confident as ever, completely unaware of what awaited him. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening. As the date approached, I barely slept. Part of me feared what would happen. Part of me feared what wouldn't, because families can survive hardship. Families can survive mistakes. But betrayal. Real betrayal, that leaves scars. Friday finally arrived. The sky over Charleston was dark. Storm clouds gathered above the harbor. The weather felt strangely appropriate. I arrived early. Victoria was already there. James sat quietly reviewing documents. Neither of them said much. There was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke for itself. One by one, everyone arrived, my mother, my father, and finally, Mason, relaxed, smiling, confident. The same confidence I'd watched him carry his entire life. The confidence of someone who had never truly faced consequences. He took his seat, looked around the room, and frowned because for the first time, something felt different. Something felt wrong. Victoria opened the folder. My father looked confused. My mother looked nervous, and Mason's smile slowly began to fade. The moment Mason saw the document, everything changed. For years, I had watched my brother talk his way out of trouble. I had watched him charm investors, convince friends, and reassure my parents whenever questions arose. Mason always had an answer, always had a story, always had someone else to blame. But not this time. This time the truth was sitting in front of him. Signed, dated, verified, impossible to explain away. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in my brother's eyes. And judging by the look on Victoria Grant's face, she saw it too. The room was silent, heavy, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. My father frowned. "What is this?" Victoria calmly pushed the document closer. "A transfer authorization signed by Mason Hayes." My mother's eyes moved between the paper and my brother. Confusion slowly turning into concern. Mason swallowed hard, then he forced a laugh, a weak laugh, an artificial laugh. "I don't even remember signing that." Nobody responded. Because everyone in the room knew exactly how weak that excuse sounded. Victoria opened another folder. then another, then another, each one containing years of financial records. Years of hidden transactions, years of carefully disguised transfers, years of deception. My father stared at the pages in disbelief. The deeper he looked, the paler he became. I had never seen Richard Hayes speechless before. Never. He was the type of man who always had an answer, always had control. But now, he looked completely lost. As though someone had suddenly rewritten reality. Because in many ways, they had. For nearly an hour, Victoria and James walked everyone through the evidence, the unauthorized transfers, the shell accounts, the private loans, the hidden debt, every document connected to the next, every explanation supported by proof. There were no gaps, no assumptions, no speculation, only facts. Cold, undeniable facts, and every road led back to Mason. My mother eventually began crying, quietly at first, then openly. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, as though she were trying to stop the truth from entering, trying to stop it from becoming real. But some truths refuse to stay hidden, no matter how painful they are, no matter how much they hurt. Finally, my father turned toward Mason. His voice sounded different, older somehow. "We gave you everything." Mason stared at the table. "We trusted you," still no answer. "We defended you," silence. "We believed in you." The room felt frozen. Then my father asked the question everyone wanted answered, the question that had been hanging over our family for years. Why? For several seconds, Mason didn't speak. Then the confidence disappeared completely. The mask finally cracked, and for the first time he looked less like the golden child, and more like a frightened man trapped inside his own lies. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought I could fix it." Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. "I lost money," he swallowed. "A lot of money." My father closed his eyes. Mason continued. "The first business failed, then another, then another. Every failure pushed him deeper into debt. Every debt pushed him toward another risky decision. And eventually, he started taking money. At first, he convinced himself it was temporary, a loan, just something he'd replace later. But later never came. The losses grew, the debts grew, the lies grew. And eventually, the entire thing became too large to stop. Listening to him felt surreal, not because I was surprised, but because after years of being treated like the irresponsible one, I was finally hearing the truth. The truth my parents had ignored. The truth they never wanted to see. The truth that had been standing in front of them all along. My father looked completely broken. Not angry. Broken. There is a difference. Anger fades. Disappointment lingers. And in that moment, I think Richard Hayes realized he hadn't just lost money. He had lost certainty, trust, belief, the image of the son he thought he knew. The weeks that followed were difficult for everyone, painfully difficult. Lawyers became involved. Financial investigators reviewed accounts. Assets were frozen. Debt negotiations began. Several properties were sold. Multiple legal agreements were signed. The process lasted months. By the end, a significant portion of the missing money had been recovered, not all of it, but enough to prevent complete disaster, enough to protect my parents from financial ruin. Mason disappeared from public life for a while. He moved out of Charleston, sold the luxury cars, sold the boat, sold nearly everything. The lifestyle he'd spent years protecting vanished almost overnight, and strangely, I didn't feel happy about it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't enjoy watching him fall, because revenge wasn't what I wanted. Not really. What I wanted was honesty. What I wanted was fairness. What I wanted was for the truth to matter. And finally, it did. 3 months after the family meeting, my parents asked to see me. I almost said no. Part of me wasn't ready. Part of me still hurt. But eventually I agreed. We met at my house. Just the three of us. No lawyers, no documents, no business discussions, just family, or at least what remained of it. My mother cried almost immediately. The moment she walked through the door. The moment she saw me, years of guilt seemed to pour out all at once. She hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry." Those 4 words carried decades of weight. Decades. I closed my eyes, trying not to cry. trying not to think about every moment that had led us here. Then my father spoke. And what he said surprised me most, not because of the words, because of how difficult they seemed for him. We were wrong. Simple words, 3 syllables, yet I had waited my entire life to hear them, not because I needed revenge, not because I needed validation, because I needed acknowledgement. I needed them to see what had happened, to finally understand. And now they did. Over the following hours, we talked more honestly than we ever had before, about childhood, about favoritism, about expectations, about mistakes, about pain. For the first time, nobody was pretending. Nobody was protecting a false image. Nobody was avoiding uncomfortable truths, and strangely, that honesty healed something, not everything, but something. A few weeks later, my parents updated their estate plan. This time, however, it wasn't really about money. The money no longer mattered. Not to me. What mattered was what the change represented: accountability, growth, understanding. The new will treated both children equally, fairly, respectfully. The way it should have been from the beginning. A year later, life looked very different. My parents retired. Their finances stabilized. Our relationship slowly improved. It wasn't perfect. Some wounds never disappear completely. But healing isn't about pretending the pain never happened. It's about learning how to move forward despite it. And that's exactly what we did. As for Mason, we still speak occasionally. Not often, not like before. Trust takes time to rebuild, sometimes years, sometimes longer. But I genuinely hope he finds peace. Because carrying lies eventually destroys the person carrying them. I know that now. We all do. Looking back, people often ask me whether exposing my brother was worth it. Whether uncovering the truth was worth the damage it caused. My answer never changes. Yes, because the damage already existed. The lies had already damaged our family. The betrayal had already damaged our family. The truth didn't destroy us. The truth revealed what was already broken, and once something broken is visible, you finally have a chance to repair it. For most of my life, I believed being overlooked meant I wasn't enough, that if I worked harder, succeeded more, sacrificed more, eventually I would earn the same love that came so easily to my brother. But I was wrong. Love shouldn't have to be earned. Respect shouldn't have to be earned. A child's worth shouldn't depend on being perfect. And if there's one lesson I carried away from everything that happened, it's this: the people who shout the loudest aren't always the ones who deserve the most trust. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one nobody notices, the one quietly doing the right thing when nobody is watching, the one who chooses integrity over attention, the one who keeps going despite being overlooked. For years, that person was me, and in the end, the truth made sure everyone finally saw it.